All right.
You are live now.
I am live. Okay, there we go. Yep, I see myself. I see myself on the thing looking at the thing. All right. See, and then I can hear myself now too. So let's turn that off. All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of what did we decide this is called, Eddie?
4 5.
Brent's Sewing Room. Let's call it Brent's Sewing Room today.
All right.
Because what I have decided, maybe that's what we should call it, because the foolishness that we talk about are the kind of things that go through my head while I'm sitting and sewing. You know, like aliens and why is Herman Melville so famous. So, when we were trying to, which camera am I on?
This one.
That one there that you were just moving around, making everybody like seasick while you were moving it?
Yeah.
So anyway, I was like trying to figure out what we're going to do today because I know how you all like to see things get sewn, not necessarily listen to me ramble on. And one of the things that we often run into is bindings. People have all sorts of questions about bindings. So I've got a couple things that need to be bound, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But I just looking over here, I realized I got to talk about shop news. Check out the calendar. My mom is going to be here in a couple weeks, and she's doing a class for, I think she's calling it Stash Busters. Basically, it's going to be a Wednesday the 7th, and just plan on bringing 6 to 9 half-yard cuts from your stash, and you're going to turn it into a quilt. That's the class. Sign up online for times, but we're pretty much going to plan on running it all day, and we'll probably call it for lunch. But so she's coming, and she's going to do that. We've got 5 seats available. It's probably going to fill up quick, if it's not already filled up. But that's Stash Busters on June 7th. The OG Baxter's going to be here. It'll be a lot of fun. Other shop news, I just thought I would show this off because, I don't know, did I work on this one on the show? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so.
But this is the Everglow from Tula Pink. I do have a pattern for this, though it's not this. But finish this up. I got to get it quilted. But anyway, I thought I'd show it off, get y'all excited. Buy some Everglow. It's some beautiful fabric. We have all of the animals for that. So check it out online. So there's that. Other thing. Oh, we're gonna be putting a binding on this today. But I thought you'd also all be excited to see the quilt that me and Mike built. Remember when Michael was on and we were sewing charm packs together? This is what it ended up looking like. So go back a couple episodes and you can see the process to make this, and then I just added a couple borders to it and called it a day. But that's made out of 2 charm packs, and I can't remember the name of the charm pack. It's like Baby Love or something, isn't it? I don't know. Who knows? What I'm really excited about, though, is this came in. I didn't get a lot of love from my bone collection Halloween that came in a couple weeks ago, but this is the new one from Free Spirit. It's called, what is it? Storybook Halloween, I believe is the name of the collection. It's available online right now. $7 shipping, or if you order over $100, it ships for free. That's the panel. That's panel 1. And then, of course, because I couldn't decide which panel I wanted to get, this is panel 2. And we're going to put both. I've got an idea for what we're going to do for a quilt for this. We'll be putting it all together, but that's the panels. But, so you can see kind of the artwork, the direction she's going. And the bats are fantastic if you like bats. Bats kind of creep me out on a certain level. What do you think, Eddie?
I think they're cool.
Sometimes they're kind of like cute, but a little bit freaky with their weird looking like mouse heads with the big ears.
Yeah.
But, I don't know, there's something about bats that's a little bit freaky. And like a fruit bat. Could you imagine like running into one of those giant fruit bats? That would just not make my day. Is that coming through real good? It's kind of dark.
I think it is.
Yep, some black cats. So black cats, some bats. Here's the cat, the pumpkin patch. The scale on this is really interesting. It's very large. So like I said, I'm putting together, I've got some ideas what we're going to do with it. But you can see just the size of that cat and those pumpkins. So you could do some fussy cutting with that and kind of make that a main portion. And then, of course, you've got the nice little coordinates of pumpkins. And then the ghost. And I believe these glow in the dark. I could be wrong. I think they glow. I'd have to double check. And then there's the ghosts. So that just came in. Check it out online. If you're interested, you can order it online. And we'll be putting together a quilt on that. We'll show that off here probably in a little bit. So, that's all the shop news I really have for today. And, like we talked about last week, we're probably going to start Next week we'll probably do another live show, but we're going to start probably sprinkling in a little bit more of the edited type stuff too, to make it a little bit more informative, more craft based than my off the wall craziness stuff. Right? All right. Kimba says hello. Who's Kimba?
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 I'd say that's.
Yeah, but Kimba says hello. But is that the same Kimba that said hello? Because that's like talking about yourself in the third person.
Oh.
Or is Kimba somebody else that's being represented by the name Kimba? Anyway. So that's all we've got for news. Like I said, sign up for the class with Becky. And then that's going to be happening here in a couple weeks. And buy some fabric. And now let's get into, we're gonna do bindings today. And while we do bindings, do you know what today's topic is, Eddie?
You said Marxism.
We're going to talk about Marxism, just because it was one of those, I fell down this rabbit hole because, everybody, you listen to enough stuff and you start to think, what is this Marx guy that everybody's talking about? And it's fascinating. I mean, some of his stuff is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and other of his stuff is kind of like, he might not have been too far off the mark. It's very interesting stuff. So we're going to get into that a little bit too today while we do our bindings. But first, let's talk about what we're going to put bindings on. So we're going to start with the bindings on this quilt here. We're going to do, the technique we're going to use is we're going to do everything by machine. So I'm going to walk you through the process of how to do it by machine. I haven't even cut the strips yet. So we're going to cover everything from the math to how many strips you need to attaching and finishing the binding. I think we should be able to, in an hour, at least get the binding done on this. I may be ambitious thinking I'm going to get all three done. But, we'll see how it goes. And as always, feel free to... oh, it's Terry. Okay. So, first thing I do is how many strips do you need to do binding?
You add up the edges.
You add up the edges, yep. So the edges on this one are what? I'm 40 on one side and say 48 on another.
So you.
So 40 plus 48 is what?
88.
88.
176.
So you got to multiply that times 2 because you have 4 sides. So you take the long side and the short side, add them together, multiply it by 2. So it's what, 176?
Yeah, then you divide it by 42. Or
You can divide it by 44 or 42 because that's usually the width of your fabric. So this is going to be our fabric that we're going to use for our binding right here. So fabric, if you look at the top, it says, can you zoom in on that? Do you see what it says? Or am I holding it at the right angle? Does it show? 43 and 44?
Yeah, 43.
Okay. So, what you can do is you figure out the dimensions and then you divide it by the width of fabric, 43 or 44. But I usually won't use the 44 number. I like 40. It's an easier number to work with. So what did we say our number was? 176?
Yeah.
So what's 176 divided by 40?
Like 4 or 5.
4 and some change. Yeah. Because 4 times 40 is 160. And 40 times is 2. So whenever you have a fractional, so it's 4 and some change, we're going to up it to 5. You never want to come up short on your strips because that's very irritating. So you just take the circumference. That's the word, right?
Yeah.
Or the perimeter. Yes,
circumference
is a circle. Take the perimeter of your quilt, divide it by 40, and that will tell you how many strips you need. And the other reason I like to use 40 is because we're going to connect our strips at an angle, so you're going to lose a few inches when you connect them. So if you go by 40, you'll never come up short with this formula. If you go for the exact 42 or 44, you can come up short if your strip count is running really close. So, like I said, we know 176 divided by 40 comes up with 4 and point something, 4 and some change. Always just round up. So we need 5 strips of this to do our binding. So far, so good? Have I lost anybody with the math? No?
Janice is asking where Becky is.
Becky? I saw Becky for a couple minutes. Some of you may or may not know, her husband loves to golf. Becky likes to golf because her husband likes to golf, not her first choice of things to do. So, when they were down in Naples over the winter, and apparently there's a really good deal for a house on the 6th hole. Brian thought that would be a great idea. Becky, not so much. But Brian, being a smart and intelligent man, knows what most of us know. A lot of times it's a whole lot easier to ask forgiveness than permission. So he just so they bought they've got a nice little spot there on the 6th hole. And then the first week I was talking to her, she hated it. And then the second week she's like, this isn't so bad. And now she loves it. So she actually came back for a couple days, and then she was picking up her grandchildren, and they were going to go spend Memorial Day weekend down there. So she's enjoying her new vacation home, which can't say I blame her. But I give her a couple more months, and then Florida summer is there's a reason that people come back to New Hampshire for the summer. So, but we'll see. I did talk to her. She's hoping to get back in here sooner than later. But like I said, life gets in the way. That happens. And we just go on. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just cutting 6 or 5 strips. Right? Cinco. How do you say strips in Spanish, Eddie?
I don't know.
5 stripos? I don't know how you... Now I'm drawing, because I know that fabric is tela. A strip would be... Arrayas, yes. Which is interesting because it actually translates as rays, not strips. But it would give the same idea if we're saying we're cutting rays of fabric. That makes it sound way more fun, too, that we're cutting rays of fabric. So the first thing I like to do after I strip everything is, especially on bindings, strips in general, but a lot of times I'll do this on bindings, is I like to just cut my salvages off first thing right out the gate. Because there's nothing like attaching sewing your binding on and getting to that final step, and you see that little bit of salvage come through. So first thing I always do is just layer them. And like I said, we have a whole entire kind of extra half a strip here, so I'm not too worried about taking too much off. So I'm just going to pop that off like so. So far so good. Everybody's excited. I probably could have made my strips before we did this, but, why would we do that? And I'm going to have to move that because I had that set up. We'll move things later if we need to show that. I'm just going to go to regular sewing. I've got a 1/4 inch foot on here. So we're just doing a 1/4 inch seam. What I'm going to do, though, I want to go back to the overhead. I've talked about this before. I love my easy angle. This is where you use the easy angle a lot. Does it show up on there? Kind of?
You can
kind of see it?
You can see there's an easy angle.
Oh, you can see there's, okay. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take one strip and take another strip, and you put them together perpendicular, which means at a 90-degree angle. Stuff I learned in high school math. Big words. What I'm doing is I'm laying this on here. These 2 edges are lined right up, and then I'm going to take my easy angle, and there's a million different ways to do this. Some people will actually draw a line from here to here and then sew on the line, which is also doable. But what I like about the easy angle is I'm just going to take it, drop it on there like so, and these are 2.5 inch strips, so the 2.5 lines up, and I'm just going to go kazoop, just like that. And if I wasn't doing it like this, I would have grabbed that before it fell. And then we're just going to take that and run it through our machine. I do find this a lot easier. I will actually, if I'm not sitting like here where I've got the table, I will actually put a small cutting mat right next to my machine when I'm doing bindings a lot of times, just because it's super easy to keep stuff going. And then we're just going to go through there. All right. So, and then I'm just going to, now I'm going to chain stitch these through. So what I'm going to do is just take the end of this one here, and I'm just going to attach the other one. And I'm just going to make a giant long strip of fabric. Now, one of the debates that you can have with somebody. Now, I'm just going to kind of throw this together, so I'm probably not going to do an awful lot of pressing today. Ideally, you're going to want to press the seam open when you do this after you get them all connected. I'm not going to bother today just because the quilt I'm throwing it on is questionable at best anyway. And you'll see. So we're putting right sides together when we do this. And we're just going to do all 5 strips like this. I'm glad that you like the color, Gene. Because I really was torn when I was picking out the color. I was not sure that chartreuse was the way to go. It worked with the charm pack that we had used. It worked with the charm pack, the colors in the charm pack, and when I put the first, because I did, if you look at the quilt, there's three borders on there. That first strip I put on, I was not sold on the color. But once I got it finished, I'm like, it really does work. It works quite well. So I'm glad I'm not the only one that likes it, and I can understand that it's probably not for everybody. Now, you'll also notice today that we're using the luminaire for this and not the featherweight. I do like the featherweight. The featherweight is fun, but one thing a featherweight does not do that a luminaire can do, or most modern sewing machines can do, is a zigzag. And it's not, and we don't need the actual zigzag feature to do a binding, but there is a trick that requires zigzag functionality to make the trick work. And you'll be seeing that here in a few minutes. But that's why we're on the luminaire and not my handy dandy little featherweight. So far, so good. Everybody.
I think
So far, okay. And this might be good for you, Eddie, because I've seen your bindings. So this might be some good help you get better bindings, because you've never asked me how to do a binding, and sometimes I'm like, what in the world did you just do when I see the binding?
My last one
Wasn't bad.
I don't know if you looked at it too close, but I don't think
I try not to because they kind of scare me. But
I think I got all the edges caught.
and then I just chain stitch it through. So I'm just gonna use my cutter here to separate my strips out. And now I have a giant long strip of fabric. See how long and giant that is. Now, if I was doing this proper, I would take my time and press my seams open. For today's demonstration, I'm going to skip that step because, we don't need to do that. So I got to live up to the name of Sewing Badly with Brent. Now, here is where another debate happens when it comes to binding. The debate is, do I now iron press iron, how everybody gets. Do I take it and iron this all in half before proceeding? What's the answer?
If you're not good at doing bindings, you probably should.
Maybe. The reason I'm not going to, I tend not to, is by ironing it in half, it puts the center point not where it needs to be for when you roll it over. It actually isn't quite proper because the thickness of the quilt changes where the center of the binding would actually be. So if you actually iron it shut, you'll notice when you roll it, it's not quite, it doesn't sit where it's supposed to. That's the excuse I use. And it could just be I'm lazy and don't feel like ironing. But you can, but you will notice that if you're somebody that's a very perfectionist and you do a heavy crease, some people will really put a nice heavy crease in here with some starch. And what you'll notice when you roll the binding over, that crease slightly sits on top. It's not even down, and that's because the thickness of the fabric changes where the center line is. So that's the excuse I use to not iron bindings. And lots of things in life, there's no right answer. If ironing the binding works for you, or you're somebody that's new trying this out, try it both ways and see what you prefer. I get fine results without doing it. It is easier to attach when it's been pressed because you're not fighting to try and keep that fold going. But for the sake of today's demonstration, I'm just going to skip that altogether, and you can all cringe as you watch me do this.
Rhonda says she presses hers.
Yep, a lot of people do, and like I said, there's nothing wrong with it. Like I said, the theory is, though, that when you roll it over, it's not going to line up perfect. Now, we're going to attach everything by machine. And what you're going to find is if you ever do a minky quilt, a minky back or a cuddle back, attaching by machine is usually the best way to go because hand sewing this stuff after is kind of a pain. It's doable, but I always do anything I'm going to do with a cuddle back gets machine quilted just because of the way I like to do it. I always start my binding on the bottom of the on what's going to be the bottom edge of the quilt, and because we're doing it by machine, we're going to attach it to the back of the quilt and then roll it to the front to finish it by machine. I have tried it both ways, finishing it by machine, going to the front, rolling it to the back. I find that I get much better results attaching to the back and rolling to the front. If you're going to do it by hand, there's never been a debate about this. If you're doing it by hand, attach to the front and roll it to the back. So far, so good?
I think so.
See? And then Kaya tells me she doesn't like, yeah, because she, maybe it's a generational thing. I don't know. Anyway, so now we're going to attach the binding. And all I'm going to do, because I haven't ironed anything, now when you start your binding, I usually start somewhere near the middle over here. I'm not going to start at the very edge of my fabric to attach it. I'm going to start probably about down here, give myself a good 12 inches or so of fabric. If you're doing like a table run, you might not have that much, but you don't want to start right at the edge because you're going to have to take that out anyway to finish it. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to start probably down here somewhere. That looks good. It doesn't have to be exactly precise, just somewhere down here. Now, let's put this over here because I want to talk about a few things. There's also some other, we're not even getting into the fun stuff today, Eddie. We're talking about sewing. That's probably a good thing because that's probably what people tune in for, right? Oh, let's back that up. Let's just back it up right here. Okay,
Unplugged it.
What's that? I just unplugged it?
Yeah.
Yep, I can see where that happened. Is it back up?
Yeah, but you know,
How's that?
that's good. I think.
All right, couple things to consider. There's lots of settings. Come back to me for a second. Go off that screen. We're going to talk about some stuff. One of the things when you're binding, here's one of those long-held debates, is how thick do you make your strips? Is it 2 1/4, 2 1/2, 3, 3 1/2? I've seen people do up to 4. I've seen people do down to 2. It's all over the map. There's no right answer, but the general idea is that when you roll your binding over on your quilt, you want, in a perfectly sized binding, the edge of your quilt is going to fill this area entirely. You're not going to have it fold over and have a little bit of extra here. It's going to fit perfectly so that the edge of the binding is the quilt and there's no empty space in there. That's the ideal situation. So there's actually math formulas that you can use to figure out how wide to make your binding. Personally, I just stick to 2 1/2. I like the way 2 1/2 comes out, and we can kind of make it work from there. Now, that being said, the math formula says that in a lot of cases 2 1/2 might be a little too wide. Because by doing a 1/4 inch seam, because how you figure the width of your binding is also how big of a seam do you put in here? Because if you put a bigger seam in, then you have to fold more to fill up the edge with the quilt. So there's kind of a balancing act there. Find what works for you. I'm going to show you what works for me. I've done enough bindings to know where my ballpark is so that it works. And I'm going to just show you a couple tricks with this. So if we come back over here to the machine, I've got on the machine a 1/4 inch foot. So that means I've got a very limited space of how wide I can change this. But one of the things on all machines that do it, well, all machines, but almost every machine that does a zigzag, the luminaire has a left-right shift. If you don't have that on your machine, you'll definitely have a width control. And what this is going to do is change where my needle is hitting in relation. What's going on here, Eddie? Oh, because I need to go to that one. There we go. Oh, I've already got my left-right shift set on this one. I don't know why I have it set there. So what you're going to find here is, I'm just going to put this back at the center. So the center position on a Brother machine is 3.5 millimeters. Now on a 1/4 inch foot, you've got a small hole in your foot that you can work with. Otherwise, you're going to start breaking needles. But you can move about a 1/2 millimeter in either direction, 1/2 to 3/4 of a millimeter in either direction, and still be in that hole. So you can still use the guide. I have found when I do my bindings at a 1/2 inch that moving my needle to the left, so I moved my measurement here down, by moving my needle to the left 3/4 of a millimeter, just 3/4 of a, yeah, 3/4 of a millimeter, yeah, that I'm going to get much better results. And what that's going to do is give me a little bit wider seam than a 1/4 inch. Because I feel on a binding, a 1/4 inch is just a little too small. I prefer just a little bit wider, and that little bit of a shift makes my 1/4 inch a little bit better. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
I think.
Okay, and I'm going to actually move this. So what I have done, if I can get both of them on there, can you see if I do this? Do you see how the needle moves as I move that? Are you seeing that?
I might probably get a bigger, closer look with this.
Okay.
In a sec.
So most modern machines, the width control. What's that?
Okay.
You see how it's moving back in little increments,
Yeah.
and I'm moving it just enough. I'm going to be on the left edge of my. I'm just moving it to be on the left edge of my 1/4 inch foot. Most modern machines, what you're going to find is the width controls for the on a zigzag stitch controls that, but on a straight stitch, the width control is going to control your needle drop. And that's all we've done is we've changed our needle drop from the center of the foot to a little bit to the left side of the foot. So that's the only adjustment I'm making. And the reason I'm doing that is that's going to give me a little bit wider seam allowance. So my seam allowance here is going to be, I don't want to say it's going to be 3/8, but it's definitely going to be closer to 3/8 than a 1/4 inch. And then if you're trying to do a scant, we talked about this a few weeks ago. If you want to do a scant 1/4 inch, you can move that needle in the other direction to get a scant without having to reinvent the wheel. You just kind of use your width control to move your needle, and you can still use the edge of your foot to be your guide. So far, so good. And I just started somewhere down there, and like I said, I haven't done any ironing at this point. And I didn't change my. The other thing I totally forgot to do is it's not going to be a problem now, but you want to make sure that you're using a matching thread, and I totally forgot to do that before I started. So I'm going to use this yellow, which isn't quite green, but for the purposes of what we're doing, it's going to be perfect. Attaching the binding, having matching thread, not super duper important. It's nice. But when you're doing the final cut, when you're doing the final stitch down, you definitely want it to match because you're going to see all the thread. So, or match in some. You could do a contrasting if you wanted and use the thread as kind of a decorative bit. But as you'll see as we get closer to the end, that is not always the case on the back. The better you get at it, the better your backs are going to look. But the first couple times, it's not going to be perfect. And let's do that. And we're going to start that. All right, well, that winds up. Any questions so far? No, Ron, I'm not calling anybody old. So, like I said, I had so much fun falling down this rabbit hole that we're going to, I don't know. Should we get into it, or should we just stick to sewing today, Eddie?
How much binding can you talk about?
Well, once we get started binding, it's going to be kind of like you get to watch me sew bindings, and we'll stop at the corners.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into it. What's Marxism, Eddie?
I don't know.
Oh, that's true. You don't follow things like I do, so you haven't heard the whole idea of Marxism and all that. Everybody talks about Marxism. Marxism this, that's Marxism, that's communist.
I know who Karl Marx is, but I don't know what he says.
Do you know the biography of Karl Marx?
Nope. I just know he looks a little funny.
He looks funny. You know why? It was very well known that he stank really bad because he didn't bathe. Karl Marx was from a biographical standpoint, which I'm not going to get into today. From a biographical standpoint, Marx was an awful man. I'm not even going to get into that. That's a whole nother story. But he's interesting. He and I have a theory about some stuff. And one of my theories is somebody wrote it down, therefore it must be true. Like the early days of the internet. Oh, I saw it on the internet, therefore it must be true. And I think that you get a lot of interesting stuff from around the Industrial Revolution when printing and everything kind of got industrialized. That a lot of stuff got written down and nobody started really questioning it. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. So Marx was born in Germany, or not Germany, Prussia. I guess it would be modern day Prussia. He ended up in England, but that's a whole nother story. Well, he ended up in England because the stuff he was writing, the government's like, we don't like what you're saying, and therefore we're revoking your citizenship. And his buddy Engels, and this is related to sewing. You know how I figured this out, Eddie? That this is connected to quilting?
Did Karl Marx have a quilt at some point?
No. The guy that financed him, because he never really had a job. I don't want to talk. Like I said, I'm not, I obviously have my views. But anyway, the guy that financed Marx, Engels, you know how his family made all their money?
Did they make...
Textiles manufacturers. He was actually his family was industrialists, and they made their money with textile cotton factories making fabric. They had a factory in, like I said, Prussia, and then his family sent him to London to go set up a factory there, and that's how he financed Marx, was through the proceeds from the factory in England, in London. But anyway, so this is related to quilting in a very tangential way. That thanks to textiles and cotton, they were able to support Marx, and he was able to write all this wonderful stuff for us. Now, most of what I'm going to get into today comes directly out of the Communist Manifesto, which is very fascinating. His other more popular work is going to be Das Kapital, where he gets into capitalism. But one of the things that I think a lot of people don't take into account when we start having these discussions and talking about this stuff, even today, you get people that are all about, Marx. One of the things that I think we often forget, because I love history. I totally forgot to take my time on that corner and show you how to do corner. So we're going to get to another corner here in just a second, and I'll show that to you. Is one of the things that I love about history, and I think that we often forget, is things don't happen in a void. Like, everything that I am and everything that I have learned is a product of a lot of the stuff that came before me. The stuff that my parents did affect, the lifestyle my parents had, has some effect on how I've turned out. And a lot of that is also true from a cultural standpoint. So if you are writing a book and you have this whole philosophy about economics and how the world works, what is that based on, right?
Around you.
The world as you understand it, right?
Yeah.
So, a Prussian philosopher is going to have a much different view about social classes than, say, an American. Because that's what I find fascinating about a lot of these discussions is we lose sight of the fact that America is unique in a lot of respects when it comes to things like social mobility. And that's a huge issue when you start talking about this. What do you know about social mobility, Eddie?
I've never heard of
You've never heard of the term social mobility? No. So social mobility kind of is a reference to, how that you can change your social standing in society. Like, for example, to use feudal systems because that's a really easy one. If you were born a peasant, what were the odds that your kid was going to be a peasant? Yeah, almost 100%. You're born a peasant, you stay a peasant. That would be a lack of social mobility. Kind of like, what's his face? Charles just got his crown, right? Yeah, he's now King Charles. Prince Charles became King Charles. So how does one go about becoming an aristocrat? Is that something that you get to work towards?
I don't know.
You're just kind of born into it. It's like the luck of the draw. Guess what? You come from a royal family, therefore you're royal. So that social mobility plays into a huge part of if you start looking at a lot of Marxist philosophy, and that's also probably why it doesn't hold up so well, because if you apply that to the American context, the American dream, are we in the overhead shot? Okay. This is the part I forgot to show you in the last corner. Luckily, we have 4 corners. So I've come to the corner. You can see that my seams aren't the best because, just this way we're going today. What you're going to do when you get to the corner, the thing to remember is you always want your raw edges to line up. So I want to keep the raw edge of my binding lined up with the raw edge of my quilt. And so the way that you do this, and this is how you get good miters on the front, is I'm going to fold my binding up. Like I said, keep it folded in half. This is where ironing it does help if you haven't done this before. So I'm going to fold that up, and this angle here, this is the angle I'm going to have when I roll my binding over to the front. So you fold it up, and I'm perfectly straight right through here. And then all I'm going to do is then fold this back down, and if I've done it properly, you're going to see that all my raw edges line up here, here and here, and it's not quite perfect, but it's good enough for us. And what should happen is this right here should sit under there like that, and it looks all nice and neat. But I'm off a little bit, but I'm not going to lose any sleep over it because, that's just how I roll. But that idea that all my raw edges are lined up, raw edge here, raw edge here. Now, I stopped sewing on this top edge about a 1/4 inch out, because if you sew all the way to the edge, what'll happen is you won't be able to fold this 45 up. You won't be able to do this right, because if you have a seam that goes all the way to the edge, your fold starts at the seam. So you got to stop about a 1/4 inch from the corner so that you can get this angle here. So if you find that you can't fold this right into the corner, it's probably because you sewed a little too far, and then you just kind of bring that down like so. It's pretty, like I said, I'll probably make it look really easy because I've done this so many times. And like I said, if I was really trying to be super precise, I would redo that fold so that that lines up right underneath. But for what we're doing, I wouldn't worry about it. All right, so once you do that, we're going to start sewing right at the edge. You don't start a 1/4 inch in, you're going to start right at the edge when we start sewing that. And we're just going to do go around to the next corner. All right, where do we leave off, Eddie? Cultural DNA. So every culture and society kind of has a DNA, kind of where it came from. So if you look at the history of, for example, America, we're basically the irate teenager of England. Like imagine like England was like your dad and you got mad, you're like, I'm leaving. That's pretty much what America is. We got mad, just left. And so that informs a lot of our cultural DNA, that kind of in your face, up yours kind of rebellion type thing. But that being said, there's also this idea of social mobility is anybody in America can be anything they want, right, Eddie?
Yeah.
If you want to be a millionaire, what's stopping you?
Not my inability.
I mean, you got to figure out what's going to make you millions, but there's nothing that says that you have to.
That I can't.
There's nothing that says that you were going to own a quilt shop, that you were going to be a fabric merchant the rest of your life, because your father was a fabric merchant, and your father's father was a fabric merchant. There's nothing that says that's going to happen. The other thing, very unique to America, did you know this? There are no titles. You ever wonder why you don't have any dukes or counts in America, in the United States?
I didn't wonder. It seemed like something we just don't have.
We don't have it. But there's actually, if you read some of the papers of like the debates, like the Federalist Papers and stuff, they actually had real conversations about it, that it's forbidden. You cannot, it is forbidden for the government to make somebody a duke or a king or a duchess or any of that. You can't do it in it. Political titles are forbidden. And so, keeping that in mind, with that in mind, this idea that a lot of Marxist theory is based. Well, in fact, I've got the quote. You want to hear the quote, Eddie?
Yeah.
Where's the quote? It's like the best quote ever. It like sums it all up, and everything flows from it. Fundamental Marxist philosophy, right here. This is a quote from Marx. Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of the oppressing and oppressed classes. So his whole theory is based on that society is founded on the idea of oppressed versus oppressor, that the relationship of somebody taking advantage of somebody else is what everything is based on. And so the whole idea of classes and social mobility is to codify the two classes, the oppressed and the oppressor. So that's a lot of the fundamentalist thought underpins what Marx writes about. So feudalism, like old school European feudalism, is really kind of one of the areas that it's coming from. So add to another quarter. Okay. Have we lost anybody yet? Probably, right? They're like, what is going on here? So that's the underlying philosophy of a lot of Marxism. Now, if you understand that, a lot of the current political stuff that you see that people that ascribe to Marxist philosophy, if you'll notice, a lot of those people are always looking to find a victim, a class of victims. And I say a victim, I'm not talking individual victims. They need an entire class of people to be victims, because Marxism only works in the context of oppressed versus oppressor. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That if you don't have that dynamic, then none of the rest of his philosophies make sense. So that's kind of the big flaw, I think, in his philosophy, was that idea right there. Now, there's some other stuff that he says that's kind of interesting, but that's kind of a... I mean, he makes it pretty... I mean, he can make a case for it. I just don't think it's a very optimistic outlook of what the human experience. But given the context he's writing from, if you look at, kind of like I said, his cultural DNA, the background that he's aware of, you can see how he arrived there. So that's the foundational philosophy, is that idea that every relationship is victim, oppressed versus oppressor. So in our situation, Eddie, because you're my kid, but you're also my employee, that means I'm oppressing you.
Whoa.
That's fundamentalist idea. That's the fundamental idea, that I'm oppressing you by virtue of our working relationship, and therefore you, as the proletariat, must throw off my chains of oppression and rise up and seize the means of control. I mean, I'm being kind of hyperbolic, but that's the idea. Okay?
So I'm supposed to take over the quilt store?
Yeah. No, not just you. Yeah, you're supposed to lead the revolt to take over the quilt store. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Because if you read Marxism, his idea was more of like a prophecy. His theory was that capitalism will evolve into Marxism. That you, Eddie, by virtue of being the proletariat and oppressed by me, at some point will be sick of the status quo and therefore revolt so that you can get what's yours. That's the underlying theory of Marxism. And this is what nobody talks about. His theory is that capitalism, by virtue of all of this, evolves into Marxism. It's just the way it's going to happen. There's no question about it. But his whole thing is, why don't we help that process along? But his idea is that Marxism is the natural conclusion of capitalism. And this is where I think he miscalculates the human experience. Because why, if you've got a decent job, your bills are paid, and you lead a good life, why do you want to be in charge? Why do you want the headaches? There's a reason that 9 to 5 became kind of the normal.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of nice. You get and that's kind of where Marxism falls down. And what's very interesting when you start to break it down, any society that has said that has kind of modeled itself on Marxist philosophy was never a free market before that. They were usually some sort of autocratic system that evolved into Marxism. But Marxism has never been formed from a free market economy. It's always some sort of autocratic political system that leads to a Marxist or a socialist revolution, which I find fascinating. Now, if you really want to find an interesting rabbit hole, what's the difference between a socialist and a communist, Eddie? There's a whole, I believe, I was trying to find the quote because I know I read it. In the world of, if you actually read a lot of the actual literature, what is interesting is there's a huge Marx and Engels. Well, Engels not so much. Engels wasn't opposed to socialists, but Marx hated socialists. There's he thought socialists were awful. Can you go grab me the mini cutting mat over there? We're going to need that in a minute. If you read through some of Marxist literature, the difference between a communist and a socialist is a communist is the working class and a socialist is the bourgeoisie. So the proletariats. The proletariats are the working class, and then the enemies of the proletariats in Marxist theory are the bourgeoisie. It's like a French word for fancy pants. And so the difference between a socialist and a communist is that a communist is working class. A socialist is that It's that guy that we all know that went to college and somehow learned all about economics and decided that the injustice in the world and they've got to go save everybody, save the working class, though they come from, some rich upper middle class background. That's a socialist versus the revolutionary working class man is a communist. That's really the only the difference when you start reading Marx's stuff. Oh, and he gets into it. Like he gets into how how they're going to have to that you won't be able to what's the word, integrate socialists into a communist. You have to defeat them outright because you can't integrate them because of their bourgeoisie roots. And yeah, that like I said, you read some of his stuff and it goes down a crazy wild rabbit hole. So far so good. So let's get into some other interesting ideas. Now let me get into an idea that I found fascinating. Like I said, most of his stuff is kind of cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, but he does bring up some very interesting points. And I think, like I said, one of the things where he missed the boat, and I haven't fully fleshed out this theory, so you all can kind of listen to me and decide for yourself. And I'm always open to some interesting ideas on it. Is when I start reading his whole concept of it. One of the things that's interesting is I don't think any of his concepts apply to commodities, like actual goods and services. Where some of his ideas might actually be relevant is among the idea of the financial markets and how financial markets work. Because his whole concept is that, well, here we go. Here's the other one. Okay, here's the quote. The theory of communists may be summed up in the single sentence: the abolition of private property. So that means you don't get to own anything. And he goes on to expand upon that idea. But here's my thought on it. He might be onto something, but not private property. The idea of private money. Because if you look at his theories of property, the whole reason that property needs to be socialized is that capital is not only a means to personal benefit. You use that capital to influence society, and therefore, if we make all capital public, you can't use it to influence the society for your own good. All right, we're going to get back to that in just a second. Put a pin in that. So here we are. We've come back. Here's where we started our binding. Here's where we're ending our binding. And like I said, we wanted a little bit of a tail here so that we have the space here. This tool here, just a mini cutting mat, works awesome for what we're about to do. So what we want to do, now there's a couple ways you can do this. The easy way to do this, if you're super lazy and don't want fanciness, which it's not hard to do what we're going to show you, but one of the things that I've seen people do is they'll just fold this like this, and they'll take this end, cut it, tuck it into there, and just run a seam. It's kind of messy, but you can kind of see the idea. So you're going to end up with a little bit of extra bulk here where everything got folded over and hooked together. That's a very common way to end. In fact, I'll show that to you here just because if I cut this extra off, you'll see what I'm talking about. This is a very, very easy and common way to end bindings is this right here. Is you just... I probably have some pins somewhere. Is that you take this side here, I just fold this edge over, and then I'm going to take this, tuck that in there, and then I'm going to fold that up, and you can see that if I run a seam up there, that I've got a nice looking binding. I've got a little bit of bulk here, but that's going to give me a nice finished binding. It will be thicker through here. You can actually feel it. You'll see it a little bit, but I did bindings like this for a number of years because it was just a quick, easy way to finish it, and that's how I learned to do it. And it finishes out nice because that fold, also when you roll it to the other side, that fold's still going to be there. Works fine. This is a perfectly acceptable way to finish bindings, and I think probably one of the easiest. And now I'm looking at it, but like I said, you end up with a lot of bulk here, and then I'm just going to show you the way that I finish them now after, because I have experiences doing this sort of thing. Is I'm actually going to get it finished so that there is no bulk, that we're going to seam it and it's going to be just fine. So what you want to do, there's no math in this if you wanted to math it, because it's a 2.5-inch binding, then you overlap your two binding ends. So I'm pulling this nice and straight out. I'm going to pull this one nice and tight too. So that if I was to sew this flat, I'm going to overlap these two ends of binding by 1 width of my binding. So I'm going to put that down there, and you'll see that that's the end of my binding right there. So I'm just going to have that lined up there a little bit. And then I'm going to pull this out from underneath so I don't cut that end of it. And I'm just going to cut this off, like so. And what you're going to see now is that this is now overlapped by 1 width of the binding. So where the width of that overlap is the same width as that. I would suggest cut it about an 1/8 inch short, just a little shorter, because it'll give you a little bit better results when it comes together. But that's all you're going to do there. Then you're going to take your easy angle, open up this side, and put your easy angle on there. Make sure that your black is to your little black tails to this side, so that your 1/4 inch is on the side you're going to cut off. I'm going to cut that off. And then I'm going to take this one, open this up the same way. Now I've done this a million times. And what has happened is I cut it in the wrong direction. So you want to make sure that you match this angle on this side. Again, make sure my 1/4 inch is on the same side as that. And you know the side your 1/4 inch is going to be on because of where that black tag is there. And we're just going to cut that like so. Now what should happen, now, do I have some pins in here? We'll do it without pins. This will be fun. So what will happen now is you'll see that these two pieces overlap. Of course, that's twisted. I'm glad I caught that. So these two pieces now overlap by 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to take that end and this end, sew that together with a 1/4 inch. All right. So like I said, what I found interesting when I was studying this Mark's stuff, when you start to look at how he complains about capital, he might be onto something if you restrict the idea of capital strictly to actual money and not to commodities. Because one of his big chief complaints, and hold on a second. And I just did what I always did. I forgot to change my 1/4 inch seam back to the 1/4 inch, so this seam's a little bit thicker than it needs to be. But for the sake of our demonstration, it's going to be fine. And then you can see I've got a 1/4 inch there. That just, if you'll see that now, that looks just like the rest of our strips. So I'm just going to keep it folded in half, and then just connect those two ends, and our binding has been attached. So far, so good? All right. So, let's get back over here. And I'm making a little bit of a mess here, but whatever. Okay. It'll all come out when I fold it over. I'm going to get a couple puckers, but whatever. Yeah, it is what it is. There we go. All right. So now we have that. What are you drawing over there? Anything good?
2012 Dodge Ram.
But you're not keeping the cameras going. They're like looking at, yeah, because I'm yelling at you. So we've got this, so everything now we're attached all the way around on the back. So now we're going to fold it to the front, and we're going to finish the final bit. The key to this is this guy here. This is a bi-level foot, and what makes it work so awesome is if you look at the bottom, if I can do this without my fingers getting in the way, you'll see that there's a little ridge on one side and it's flat on the other side. So what's going to happen is this flat section here is going to sit on top of my binding. That ridge is going to ride right next to my binding. You'll see it here in a second once I get it set up on the machine. So, I'm just going to drop this foot, throw this bad boy on there. So, now here's another place. If you do want to press your binding, this will make a big difference at this point. Would be to roll this over. Now, this is where if you had pressed your binding and I roll this over and you pressed it really sharp, you would see the seam would be a little bit more over here, not flat over here. What I would recommend though is if you do like to press things, this is where I would press it. I would roll this over and just kind of run as with it rolled over, press that down. I would warn against if you have polyester batting that you're not too hot because you'll melt things. But this is a time that pressing does make things a little easier. For what we're doing, we're just going to keep going. The other thing you can also do here that I've done in the past is I might use clips or pins to maintain all this as I'm going. Right now, I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to throw this on there because, you know, it is what it is.
Can you show the foot again that didn't focus? So we could just keep it, just like flip it over on it?
Yes.
Like on the machine?
Oh, on the machine? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Like
Right
that.
there. So if you'll notice, there's a little ridge here. This side of the foot is up a hair more than this here. So the binding is going to ride right inside here, and that's going to be the edge of the binding, and it's going to work as a guide to keep everything lined up. And we'll see that here in just a second. So, and now when we're doing the final stage here, we are going to start right at a corner, and I usually just start fold it over. The other thing, let's go back over here for a minute. So the other thing you may also want to do at this point, I do know that you could shorten your stitch length. I tend not to worry about it too much. But the other thing you want to do is I'm going to set my machine all the way to the left position, which it didn't do. Why didn't it do? Because it doesn't like me. There we go, all the way to the left. 0, 0 is all the way to the left. What you're going to find, can you zoom in down here, Eddie? What you're going to find is you want to put the needle as close to this edge, not right up against the edge because your fold's going to ride there. So you want to come in a hair off of that edge. So I'm going to go all the way to the left, and I have found that coming in, not that one. Coming in, I usually come in a full millimeter. So I come in a full millimeter off this edge here. So I have my left-right shift on the machine set to 1. But that brings me a full millimeter in off this edge. And what we're setting here is how far in, if you're looking here on our binding, my finger's in the way, kind of. Right here on the binding, how far in that stitch is going to be. If you're really good, like Brenda's super good at this, she can get that stitch almost right up to this fold. I'm not that good, so I go in about a millimeter, so I'm going to be a little bit further in, so it's going to give me a little bit more of a flange, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in just a second. So all I'm going to do is I've got that set, and I'm going to set this. I'm going to start right in the corner. And you can see, if you look closely, you can see how my binding is riding right in that little groove there. And I'm going to roll that over, and I'm just going to go. Now, you can also, at this point, I'm starting right in the corner. You can lock this stitch in if you like. That corner is going to get folded over. I'm going to come back around, so I'm not too worried about that corner. And then I'm just going to sew, keeping this folded over. And now, the other thing to keep in mind is your reference point, how far over to fold it. You see, this is your seam from the other side. So as long as you want to fold past that just a hair, because that is where the fold is on the back of the seam. So the idea is to get the needle to come down right on this line here and have that line covered here. If you could sew directly on that line, you're going to be stitched in the ditch on the back, but you have to cover it with the front here so so it looks good on the front. So that's the balancing act you're trying to accomplish, and you'll see here in just a minute what I'm talking about. And I'm just going to fold that over. Like I said, I'm just coming past that seam a little bit because that's my reference. And you can also see on here, so the width here, how far that is off the edge, I set that with my left-right shift, or you can set that with your width control on your machine. So I'm a millimeter off of the edge. If I had set it all the way over the edge, I'd be closer here. I cheated in a little bit so I don't have to be quite as precise as I'm going. And I don't know that we're going to do all 4 sides because we're running out of time. and I didn't. But hopefully, I'll learn something. Didn't get into all the craziness I was going to talk about today, but it was interesting. Like I said, things to take away from Marxism. If you're going to follow, if you're going to start down the rabbit hole, the things to keep in mind is Marxism is completely defined by the victim versus abuser relationship. So the oppressed versus the oppressed, the oppressor and the oppressed. Everything is viewed through that paradigm in Marxism, and the philosophy is that, and the overriding idea is that capitalism will evolve into Marxism. And like I said, there's a lot more that goes around that, but there is some interesting ideas when he starts getting into the bourgeoisie and how they have to always expand and expand. They always have to find new markets to make their economic model work, which I thought was an interesting insight, because that is true of investment market, of money markets and monetary markets. Is if you're making your money off of other people's money, you have to constantly be expanding that market, because it's through the expansion that that money's created. And like I said, in the context of actual physical money is interesting, but in the idea of commodities and labor, I don't think the theory holds up. But like I said, it's an interesting rabbit hole I want to spend some more time going down. And then I was going to, if you couple that with what we talked about Bitcoin last week, the idea that Bitcoin is actually a publicly owned money is true, because the ledger, the Bitcoin ledger, is transparent and open and owned by the public, not by one individual person. So the theory, from a monetary standpoint for Marxism, might actually have some merit. And I don't know if anything I just said made sense, but in my mind it did. And no, I'm not a Marxist, but it's interesting stuff. So you can see that we just, and here you can kind of see this is a really good example of bad sewing, because you see that we can still see a little bit of that other seam. I'm not going to worry about it because of what this quilt is, but you can see we didn't come quite far enough over, so you can see that. But now on the back is where you're going to see the closer that we rode. The closer that we got to that seam, the closer we were to stitching the ditch. And you can see with a little bit of practice, you get fairly close. But there's going to be a couple spots on here that we rode a little bit further in, and there'll be some that we're a little bit further out. But that's machine attached binding. Like I said, with practice, this part here can look really good. And honestly, on the front, that doesn't look bad at all, because it's fairly consistent, because that foot gives you a nice consistent look on the front. It's the back that takes practice to get that lined up right every time is where it's interesting. So anyway, that's attaching bindings, and when you come to the corner, you're basically just going to take your binding, fold it over, and continue the process. You start in the corner, and then the big thing is, getting that fold. If you did the back right, you should be able to fold that front over and get your 45. And that's a quick, easy way to do bindings. Like I said, you don't necessarily need a bi-level foot to do bindings. You want some. It's a lot easier if you have a foot of some sort that will guide your binding to keep it where you want it to go along your attached binding. The bi-level foot works really good. I've tried stitching the ditch feet before. There's an edge foot that I've tried. The stitching the ditch foot I used for a long time till the bi-level foot came out. Stitching the ditch works really good for this as well if you've got one of those. Not quite as good as the bi-level foot. But for machine attaching binding, you could probably do it just a regular flat foot. It's just going to take a lot more precision. It's not going to be as easy as it is with the right foot. So I'm hoping, like I said, we'll probably wrap it up there. The rest of the process is we're just going to keep going around the quilt. And when you get to the other side, you just lock your stitch in and away you go. Like I said, you don't necessarily need to lock your stitches in on the corner, because when I start this next side, I'm going to fold that over, and that's going to cover that up, and I might want to lock the starting stitch in so that it doesn't come out. Personal preference, I've never really worried about it. But, you also have seen how I sew, so I don't know if my opinion sometimes is worth it. So anyway, I think that's all I have for today. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments before we sign off this bad boy?
I don't think
You don't think so?
we got everything.
We got everything? Nobody's okay. I'm glad you all joined us. Like I said, I've got a video plan that we're actually going to put together with a little bit of luck We may have be running an edited video next week, but the idea will be that during the live feed we'll have a pre-recorded video, but we'll be there live as like a premiere, so we can have like the chat go on with it. Not set in stone yet. We still might do another one of these, but we're working kind of in that direction. We'll see how it goes. As always, like, subscribe, and all that stuff. Thanks for watching. So on, and be excellent to each other.